Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Digital Leader Show. We are live each Wednesday at our new time, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, and 6 p.m. Central European Time. We're on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and the recording will be available on major podcast platforms next week. Our goal each week is to help you become a better digital leader as we transform into a digital society and digital enterprises. And we're discussing the key issues and news at the intersection of business, technology, and the humanities. I'm Dan Goodstein. I head up the Digital Enterprise Institute and the Institute for RPA and AI. My co-host is Carlos Alvarenga. He's the Chief Research Officer for Digital Enterprise Institute, an author, educator at Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. He's a former advisor and head of membership at World 50. Carlos, welcome back.
Dan, good morning. Good to see you again.
Great to see you. So, we wanted to talk this week. There's a lot of news going on around the current state of outsourcing as it relates to enterprises, the use of technology, but in particular, this kind of gig economy that's been really I think it was fueled by the pandemic. It wasn't new, but it's definitely been fueled by the pandemic and its effects on the workforce, corporations, just the work environment that we're on. We actually talked about the gig economy a bit in our first ever Digital Leader Show back in May. So it's, again, it's not a new topic, but things kind of seem to be heating up. So what's happening out there?
Yeah, hi Dan. I think the issue that we're talking about here ties back to this issue, the transformation of work. We go back to, we could call it outsourcing 1.0, right? The original version, you had a workforce that was relatively homogeneous. And we thought about outsourcing, we sort of knew what it looked like. It was IT or call center work, right? And we sort of knew where it happened, places like India and the Philippines. What we're seeing today post-COVID is that sort of monolithic block of what outsourcing was has changed. And now we add to it at two other extremes, right? Let's say two other segments. One is at the very, very high end, the kind of star programmers in Silicon Valley, the freelancers in Hollywood, the people who make seven-figure salaries as gig workers, working project by project. And at the other end, the folks who do work by task at DoorDash, at Uber, and who operate in a completely different sort of model, right? They're not offshore, they're onshore, they're actually in our neighborhoods. And so what the gig economy is doing is creating this sort of, now we have sort of three blocks to think about when we talk about that. And what's coming is a fourth, because there's a great book that came out a few years ago called The Future of the Professions that talked about how technology would affect the sort of the last group that hasn't been touched: doctors, lawyers, consultants, accountants, right? The professors. And with COVID, we began to see the prophecies of that book sort of finally come into play. And so I think in a few years, when we talk about outsourcing, we're going to talk about four blocks: the kind of professional class, which already has started in academia, right? We have this adjunctification in higher ed. We've got it in entertainment and in high tech. You've got the traditional outsourcing kind of work. And now you've got the task-driven gig economy that we run into on a continual basis whenever we use companies like Uber and DoorDash. So it's become a more complicated issue, and it only continues to grow, I think.
Yeah, I wonder. I wonder if it's become a more complicated issue, or if people are trying to overcomplicate it. The debate around outsourcing has always been a debate. I remember, as you know, we launched an outsourcing. Our first association was the Outsourcing Institute back in '93, and it's since evolved into some of our new associations, AI and Digital Enterprise Institute. But for 20 plus years, all we did was talk about outsourcing, right? And there was always the people, especially in our social circles, who would corner us at a barbecue and say, "Why are you promoting outsourcing? Why are you helping this happen? And aren't you a patriot? And don't you want jobs in the U.S. and those kinds of things?" My response was, I'm not the one doing it. I'm just the one kind of reporting on it. But it's kind of inevitable, right? It's the evolution of corporate America, of the corporate world, where you're trying to figure out how to get things done the most efficiently, most cost effectively, and if you believe the promise of outsourcing, the most the ideal way to do it is to hire experts who live and breathe this stuff every day to do these things, versus every corporation trying to figure out how to do finance or HR or call center work.
Then I think it's two things that drive outsourcing, right? At least from my experience, one is uh, a simple one to understand, and one is a more complicated one. Let's say one is visible and one is sort of behind the scenes. The visible one is just consumers. You give consumers a choice on Amazon for the looks like the same product. One was made in a low cost country and it cost you $10. One was made on shore and it cost 15. Overwhelmingly over the last 10 years on platforms like Amazon, the average American or consumer has voted for the $10 version.
Yep.
Right? And asked too many questions about where it came from. And that happens every single day, millions of times. And that's what made Amazon what Amazon is, in part. The other one is more abstract, and that is value creation models, right? It's something that I wrote about when I was at Accenture, which is that in many cases that you got outsourced in a job has nothing to do with whether you're doing that job well or not. What happens is that for lots of reasons, that job can create more value at a third party firm than it can in your company. I wrote at the time about analytics specifically, and how there would come a day where the person who was doing analytics inside of a big company, that role was going to be more valuable at a company like Accenture or Deloitte. There would be new career paths. And so the the value it could generate would be higher at Accenture. And so Accenture would decide, let's go into the analytics outsourcing business, which is exactly what happened. And so I was there when we created the first supply chain outsourcing around forecasting, demand planning, these kinds of functions. And there was a huge debate about would anybody ever outsource analytics or forecasting and planning. And the answer was eventually, yes, they would, as long as the output was better. And so I think that's the same thing is happening in other cases where the market forces suddenly shift the value creation model for a job from inside of a big company as a regular employee to a third party, and suddenly everything changes.
Yeah, and I guess part of my struggle with some of these debates that you see out there is, listen, there's always people that were against outsourcing. If you watched every political, cycle and election campaign in the U.S., it was always about bringing jobs back. But the reality was in the real world, right? Every company outsourced. Every company did this, and not only did every company outsource to their local payroll provider down the street, they also offshored. At least the large ones did, right? So, it was discussed, it was debated, but let's say for the sake of this argument, it was widely accepted as a business practice for large multinational companies to do that. And that debate was more or less settled. And then, to me, what changed was technology got to a point where, first of all, you could now create a lot of that efficiency without having to offshore.
Yeah.
So there was all this conversation when we first launched ERPA, and it was exclusively focused on RPA type of automation in particular. The original people we spoke to were all saying we're going to start insourcing jobs. We're going to start bringing some of these jobs back from India, and then enable people in the U.S. to be more efficient leveraging technology. Debate on whether that's really what happened or not, but that was sort of the promise. So you have that angle of, hey, if you really outsourced because of expertise, or you're really outsourced because of efficiency, you can gain some of those things back through emerging technology, automation, and AI. But I think the other thing that it did is the technology started democratizing outsourcing to a point where you didn't have to hire a large global outsourcing firm. You could go on a website and get tasks done. You could hire a virtual assistant. You could get a graphic designer. You could get some of these individuals now that you really couldn't get access to before.
It's a very good point. Now you can micro outsource, right? You want to call it that. Before there was always a minimum number of people in order to get an outsourcing firm kind of to take the contract. Today, we're down to the units of one, and even in hours, right? And also the other issues that we see now is that, and I'm being very simplistic here, but in that wave one, if you were a programmer in Chennai, and I met lots of them at the time, getting hired by Accenture or Deloitte or Infosys was kind of an upgrade, right? You typically would make more money than you were working for a local firm. It was a prestigious job. So it was an enhancement to the person who was being given that role, independent of what's happening back kind of in the country of the outsourcing company. Today, it's a big debate as to where the people who are getting the jobs delivering food or delivering or taking these tasks, right? Whether it's an upgrade for them. It seems that the you read the press and it kind of they tend to kind of fall on one side or the other. Either it's bearable or it's great. I think the reality is more nuanced. There are people for whom this new gig economy, platforms like Upwork and others are a good thing. But I think for a lot of other people who are delivering meals at 10 p.m. on a rainy Saturday night, I think they would disagree. I think they'd much rather be in a stable, traditional job environment. And for them, the gig economy is probably a nightmare.
So the world's changed, right? And we've talked about this in previous episodes as well. I think, and this is, I said this before, it's still a bold statement. I think that brand and employee loyalty is kind of gone or very quickly going away. Especially where you have this, we've debated in the past the Great Resignation and the workforce and things, and why people left the workforce and didn't come back, largely didn't come back in many cases. And then you have this scenario where companies couldn't hire quickly enough. Lots of open jobs and things, but yet people seem to be happier in this new model of, hey, I can work from home, I can work whatever hours I want, I can work for multiple companies, I don't have to go into the office because this big tech company told me now that work from home is going away. I can get some of the benefits of running my own business. And the stat that we talked about back in May was at least at that point 36% of workers in the U.S. were somehow part of the gig economy, right? So they either went all in, or they were at least had a side hustle, a side gig that they were doing. And supposedly that's up like seven. That was before the pandemic. Now it's up another 70% on top of that. So whatever, 70% more of 36% of the U.S. workforce. That's a big number. That's a big number. So why if it's so bad, why are so many people doing it?
Because I think it's a combination. I think for some people it's good. It's bad. That's why I think the simplistic articles at recent time, which claim that it's great for everybody, right? When you see kind of the cheerleaders of the gig economy, or the ones who say it's bad for everybody, the naysayers, they're both right and they're both wrong. There are people for whom this is great, but the retail worker who's getting a schedule every 72 hours, who can't plan their week a week ahead of time, because the algorithm that decides how much labor is going to be needed at the store, which is pre-COVID, doesn't tell you until the last minute, right? That person, I don't think is a happy in that particular environment. I think there's a term that was coined a few years ago by a couple of researchers called ghost workers, and I think for a lot of those roles, that's kind of what they are. And I think this is a big question for social and digital leaders, just as human beings, right? Especially after COVID, when you had somebody who came to your house on a rainy night and was driving through town to bring you a dinner. Pre-COVID, you at least had this human interaction, right? Of saying thank you, seeing the person's face, having this interchange, this sort of human to human moment. Post COVID, when some of you got leave it at the door, right? Leave it at the door. This is, to me, was this monumental thing. Now the worker became a ghost worker. A doorbell is rung, or you get an app on alert your app, and then this invisible person left the meal for you, and they're gone by the time you get to the door. So what do we make of that as a society? Of that this is now an accepted way for people to service us, quote unquote, as consumers. And there was a couple of years ago, I remember there was a DoorDash email that they sent out, and it was April Fool's, right? And it was an April Fool's joke and fantastically bad taste, if I remember correctly. And it had It said, "Meet our new dashers," and what it had was a picture of like a beagle pulling a cart with food on it. Um, I'm sure if you were working very hard that day delivering food as a human being, you didn't think it was a very funny joke to have your value equated to a job that could be done by a dog. And to me, there's truth in every joke, as the old saying goes, and I wonder whether that how far that the truth of that joke goes up, into the management levels of those kinds of companies.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it gets into culture, company culture and identity. We talked about last week. But I don't know. I'm still not convinced. In an environment of whatever it was, 5-6 years ago, or the previous recession when jobs were hard to come by. I could see saying, hey, these people don't have a choice, and they're in these jobs because they have to be, and they're being treated poorly, and they don't have an option. But if you believe so, and it's changed a little bit now, right? There's a lot of companies that have pulled back on their hiring in the last few months since we've had the first conversation about the Great Resignation. But at least in June, when we talked about this last time in May, there were a lot of open jobs. So if those gig workers don't like that employer or that model, why don't they go back to the big corporations? I think they've shown us they don't want to.
Well, keep in mind that a lot of them, they're doing both, right? Again, there's this mythology of what's real. If you look at the statistics, a lot of gig workers, it's their second or third job.
Right.
So they are doing the corporate thing, but that isn't enough. And so they're side hustling, right? Tax or delivers in the weekend, because that's what it takes to make ends meet, especially as inflation continues to rise. So once again, I think there are a lot of myths about what the gig economy is, and there are certainly a large number of people, I'm sure, for whom it's fantastic, right? If you've got talent that the market values, and you can call your own shots and pick your own workers. I've talked to people on Upwork, and they'll tell you, I'm very happy because I can pick my boss. It's almost like the freedom of this company isn't a great place to work. So what? I'll never take work from them again. And for them, it's great. But then there's another population for whom I think it's actually a pretty awful way of living. And just as leaders, the people who create these platforms, I think they have some responsibility to consider both sides and to admit that both sides exist, as you're seeing in Europe, right? Because the ground zero for this fight isn't the United States, it's Europe. And you see it on a country by country basis, where in the UK and Spain, and in many cases, the companies, once the government decides or society decides these are actual employees, the companies leave. Deliveroo left Spain, for example, UK company, once the Spanish said these are actually employees. And I think that's, if you want to follow the cutting edge of this debate, right, it's actually happening in Europe. And I think while some things may stay there, some of the things that are ideas that are being created there are flowing back to the U.S. California, for example, right, when they passed the proposition, the law that said that they were going to be employees, gig economic workers, the voters basically revolted against it and overrode, right, the politicians and said no. But I think that debate continues to grow, and as it expands to more and more sectors, again, as it reaches more into white collar workers, into managers, into the kinds of people who in the past this really was an issue for them, then perhaps what looks like a European debate today will become an American one as well.
Yeah, I guess the point I'm trying to make is the debate is not new. It's just accelerated again, I think, based on this gig economy thing. I guess the question comes back to, and this is not a political show, but it's meant to kind of help people think about how to run companies and think about these types of issues. And so I think I think it gets back to the age-old debate about a company's role and unionization and things like that. At the end of the day, if these companies cease to exist, is that good for the consumer? Is that good for the employer? I mean, 'cause we've all been through this. It's I was reading this article on Wired magazine about what's happening in Europe around the legislation, and they talk about what the criteria is for an employee versus a self-employed worker. And it was reminiscent of conversations I've been having for decades with people about their own departments of labor in the US about, hey, can you hire that person as a consultant? Can you hire that person as what constitutes a self-employed individual versus somebody that you have to put on payroll? And all those outsourcing companies we were talking about, they all did this, right? There's a big move, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, where all of a sudden all the big banks had to lay people off, but then you look at their outside consulting numbers and they went up significantly, right? They all did it. They figured out how to do it. But at the end of the day, if you're running a company, you have to balance out, what's the best way to run that company, effectively. And I guess the question then becomes how much of the employee, if there are choices, do you just let those people move on to other roles if it's not an attractive employment situation or contract experience?
And to be fair, right, the hiring someone in Europe is a much different proposition, and firing someone in Europe than it is in the United States. I've done it, and the conversation is completely different. You're going to bring on a full-time employee in Holland as it would be in Mississippi. That said, maybe it comes down to two things. There are people who do lead the kinds of companies, that use these platforms and who create the platforms. One, there is an economic question of what is owed to someone who makes a living off of your platform. And I think it's a big difference between someone who it's a side gig to pick up a little bit of extra money and the person from whom the majority of their income, their livelihood, to use an old phrase, depends on your platform. To the people whose livelihood depends on your platform, there are going to be two conversations. One is, what do you owe them economically, right? What is the economic responsibility of that person? But we can say, because this is a show that also about the humanities, what is an ethical responsibility to that person, right? And so I think that the first one has taken, the first question is where the leaders who build those platforms tend to want to live in, and they really avoid the second conversation as much as possible. And just because you don't have an economic responsibility to someone doesn't mean you don't have an ethical one to them as well.
Yeah, I'm just still on this. Are businesses there to create opportunities, or are businesses there to be, welfare? And by the way, I'm
but that's
very
a long way from accepting that there's an ethical responsibility to somebody who makes a living off your platform. For example, for not putting them at risk, of physical harm, to welfare. Right, that's a pretty big jump from what I
No,
was
100%. So safety aside, but these are not. I don't think. I don't think these are pre-union labor environments, right? They're not. Maybe they're not great jobs.
And you're delivering food, and you get the task that says go deliver to this address. The company knows that 2 out of the last 10 drivers who went there got beat up and wound up at the hospital.
That's different.
Wouldn't you want to know that? Okay,
100%.
but economically, they don't owe you that information. Ethically, you might say that they do. All I'm saying is that second conversation of what is owed ethically to someone who makes their living off your platform seems conspicuous by its absence from the dialogues of all these quote unquote innovators who create these platforms. And it's only going to expand. Look, I have a good friend who's a surgeon, right? And he's now trying to recruit. He and his partner have a surgery practice out west. They're trying to get young surgeons to buy into the practice now, which nobody wants to do. What they want is a salary. So my buddy, who has worked all his adult life, right after all those years of training, hoping now that he would sell his practice, he and his partner can't find a buyer. The only ones who are willing to buy it are private equity firms at this point, who are collecting, practices in his field, all over the country. Then once it's bought, they become a contract worker in many cases, right? So he's not happy about this, but and now he, as a highly trained, Johns Hopkins educated uh, surgeon, is going to be feeling some of the same issues right at the macro level, and dealing with some of the same questions about what is owed to him economically and ethically, whether by the PE firm, that the person who's delivering right food for DoorDash is facing today. So while we think of it as that level, as a DoorDash Uber type issue, it's headed to the professions a lot faster than people think.
But I would argue that and again, little political, but I would argue that mentality stymies innovation, right? If I know that I can't create an app or a platform that could change the world, I can't create it because you're going to tell me that every user of my platform becomes an employee, and I've got to take on that cost, risk, overhead, whatever. I'm not going to create that technology. So I think there was an interesting article a while back about the UK. And I think it's in this Wired piece also that we were talking about, where they talk about whether or not somebody is an employee based on the local laws of those jurisdictions. And I couldn't help but think to myself, are these government agencies, are they really trying to protect the citizens and the workers, or is it just governments trying to take their cut, just trying to get their piece of the revenue that's being avoided now because they've been disintermediated, right?
Well, and it could be both, right? One doesn't preclude the other. And by the way, let's talk about a related topic, but it's completely different, and something I shared on LinkedIn this morning, and that's about the data of the platforms. So one of the newer conversations is, I drive for Uber. Every time I drive, my movements is data collected by the platform. That's value added. The fact that I drive creates data value for the platform. Okay, whatever the platform is. And so now the workers are saying, I'd like to be able to see that data, right? And we're seeing the first generation of gig worker data pools that are being created that allow collectively, right, people on the platform to access some of that information and derive some of the value at the individual level that the platform owners get at the macro level. So that's the other issue here too, right? Is that it isn't just the task, but let's say I have a right to at least see, right, the data that's being created by the roles that we create, and don't we as a group have that? It's almost like, if you could imagine that there's a union, that a driving union is created, and one of its demands is, we want big data about ourselves, right? Something that we don't ever think about is associated with sort of labor demands. Information as an asset will enter the labor conversation, or already has, right? When you're seeing at the margins this issue.
Yeah, and that's interesting, right? Because now all of a sudden the data becomes so what is there's that old thing about for people that use Google and these services and the privacy conversations and debates, if you're not paying for it, you are the product, right? But I guess my question, and again, not in a desire to debate, but really, for somebody watching this who is trying to figure out a business. Listen, we're in a digital transformation age. I think everybody is rethinking revenue models, business models, employee experience, customer experience. We have a webinar in a couple of weeks about how you have to change your employee experience in order to affect the customer experience in this environment. So I think everybody watching this is probably thinking about this. Where do you monetize? Where do you cut costs, right? Is it around the people? Is it around safety? Obviously, those are easy ones to me, right? The safety issue. But what I say though about the gig thing is the same thing I said about outsourcing, which is, if you're willing to pay more, Mr. Consumer, Mrs. Consumer, then your bank or your hardware, computer hardware, or your phone company might not need to outsource. They might not need to implement these technologies. They might not need to leverage a gig workforce. But then you're going to pay more, and if you don't, then do these services survive? Do I think if this is still accurate, DoorDash, Uber, their margins are razor thin. Some of them are losing money. I think Uber went down like 25%. So this isn't the only example of the gig economy. But what would happen if, all of a sudden all the people on TaskRabbit or some of these other services, all of a sudden they were employees, right? These sites start to shut down. And we actually go the opposite way. We go back to centralization, where you need a large firm to get access to resources on the other side of the globe. I don't think that's good for economies. I don't think it's good for the worker. I don't think it's good for the consumer.
Well, I think as a society, Americans generally speaking, again, from where we are today, is that they side with you and they say, we don't really want to deal with this. So we'll let the platforms figure it out, which then leaves it back to the workers, right, to find a solution. And you see that, right? You see the rise today of the college educated labor movement, which is a new phenomenon, right? Starbucks and a few other, the Starbucks has been the people who have been leading the way, but millennials who on the younger end, who have huge student debt, who decided, hey, my Starbucks tenure is not going to be a side gig or a temporary thing until I get the job that I always wanted. This could be the next 15 years of my life. And so we better get organized. That's in a nutshell, the logic of the people who are leading that, as I've read it into general press. And so you have this other issue, right? Of, well, then the it's their problem, and they're starting to organize. But then there's one other thing too, and that is, I had a conversation a couple of years ago with a chief HR officer of a very big American company, and what she said to me was, I'm fascinated by the idea of Uberizing our workforce. Okay, this is a company of, I'm going to say 60, 70,000 full-time employees. What she wanted to know is, how can that be done? And her comment to me was that the biggest impediment was the HR systems, the way the HR, right, infrastructure, IT infrastructure was the biggest impediment to do that, because it just wasn't built for an Uberized, majority Uberized workforce at a company of 100,000 people. It could be that that's changing, and it could be that once these technological impediments to doing that are kind of addressed, which I know is going to take a while, but then suddenly this debate will be about we'll be having the same debate, but not about the outsourced workforce, but about just the workforce, right, in a company. And I think if you're a digital leader, you have to ask yourself, okay, what does that mean? If that is where we're headed in part or in whole, then back to the question of responsibilities I have and how do I manage in that environment. And one other point to make here is this: these platforms are innovating one other way, especially Uber, right? And that is the rise of the robot manager. Traditional management theory was that you had the very senior executives, you had the quote unquote worker, and you had middle management. And middle management is a command and control layer, right? And what it did was it made sure that the workers did what they were supposed to do per the wishes of senior management. At companies like Uber, that's done by software. And we have now the first generation of software bosses, right, who have replaced middle management. If this gigification of the economy continues, we're going to see that inside big companies as well. It's already there in small traces.
Yeah.
But that's the thing too, is to the extent that the innovation continues, Dan, I don't think we're that far off from, you come out of college and you get a first job and your first boss is not a person, or your second boss isn't a person, it's a robot. So how many degrees away are you when you get hired into a big company from your first robot boss? And then what does that mean?
If my robot boss is as logical as it could be, I might prefer that. I think what's exciting to me is that the paradigm has shifted, right? When we launched ERPA, our biggest and just like the outsourcing, right? We always pick these really controversial topics. With RPA, it was, this is going to take jobs. This is going to take jobs, and it's technology is going to take jobs, and there's only so much you could say. Technology is inevitable, the next industrial revolution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think where the opportunity is, and you've heard me say this as well, is maybe these are better jobs, right? Because all of a sudden, that person in the call center who has 14 different screens to look at and has to manually enter 20 minutes worth of notes into 5 different systems on multiple different programs, and then has to hear you complain about how long it takes and how much you hate the company and all that stuff. That ain't a good job. I don't care if you're in India, the US, you're on the other end of an app somewhere. That's not a good job, right? So that's, to me, the excitement now is, and that's just one example. There's examples in software development. There's examples in, I was talking to a retail company this week who's, leveraging AI in decision making. They have a really tough job. Supply chain managers right now, not a fun place to be. Not a fun place to be. If you had, a bot next to you and an intelligence that's helping you do your job better, I would argue that that's actually a good thing.
Yeah, but let me give you a scenario. So let's say that in a mind experiment, right? A thought experiment, that Uber's ultimate aim has nothing to do with transportation. Just follow me. Let's say Uber tomorrow announces Uber HR software. They perfected the algorithm middle manager. It is now available for any company to hire. So Uber is now not a transport company only. Uber IT opens up, and any company can deploy, right, Uber HR to run its businesses.
That's what Amazon's done for retail, right?
Right. Okay. So I'll go back to a story I tell you from my early days in consulting. My first consulting firm was an old school partnership. Everybody knew each other. Right, big firm, but it was built on partner model. And every year we did an evaluation, and the evaluation I used to say was, it was benevolent subjectivity. Okay, there was no way the partner really knew everything you'd done, but they more or less had your best interest in heart, I think. And we were all pretty happy as junior associates with the process. The firm was acquired by a much bigger company that brought in a statistical evaluation process. Okay. So suddenly we went from what I would call, right, sort of semi-ignorance subjectivity to, informed objectivity. At the end of the year, everybody hated the outcome. And so I asked my boss, and people asked, hey, why didn't I get a raise? Well, the process decided you don't deserve a raise. Hey, why didn't I get a promotion? Well, the process decided, hey, why didn't I get this? Well, the process decided. And I told my boss, when I joined the firm, my dream was to be a partner. Now my dream is to be the process. Okay, that's my objective, because apparently the process is running the firm as of now.
Yeah, but those are the exceptions versus, and I agree. We got to be conscious of those things in technology, right? But we can't completely outsource it to technology, right? But you hear the discussion, this point all the time about the self-driving car and how it mowed down a bunch of people. But what you don't hear about is the fact that it's statistically a better driver than the majority of human drivers, right? So yeah, there's kinks that have to be worked out, but
you'll be happy if you come to work at a big company, you're working at wherever, and they say, hey Dan, here's a black box. This is now your manager. You guys can schedule time to talk to each other. And
if it means my job is easier, more fun, and I get to spend more time with my kid, yeah. Yeah, and I prefer, and I learned a long time ago. I believe there's 2 types of people. There's 9 to 5 people that like to work, 9 to 5, do their job well within the confines of that, and that's it. And then there's entrepreneurial type of people that work billion hours a week, and they don't have those parameters, and plenty of debates here, right? But I really do feel like people fall into one of those 2 categories. So for me, I'd rather be at the end, and maybe Uber is a bad example because there's abuses or whatever going on. I don't know, but take a platform where you can hire somebody, an expert. We talked before, graphic designer or whatever it is. um, those are good gigs, and those people get to choose, like you said before, they get to choose who their employers are. They get to choose what platforms they're on. If you're a jerk employer, they'll stop showing up to work. There's no HR, and vice versa. You don't have to deal with an HR department or a labor department or whatever. So I think it's much more in tune with business today. If you're an entrepreneur, maybe this is less of an issue for the big companies, but
Well,
maybe for
I
the
think
small companies.
we have an issue of job security. And I've said for a long time, there are two kinds of job security. There's institutional and there's individual, right? So you may have low individual job security in the sense that if you on your own are at risk, but because you are part of a big institution, the institution itself, like a lot of government workers have this phenomenon, right? That they're hard to fire, institution doesn't go anywhere. So they have high institutional job security, even if they have low personal job security, distinct from the superstar programmer, right? Who's working for a startup funded by a rich VC. The startup goes under, they don't care because they have super high personal job security, and so they'll land a gig 24 hours later. I think that that's for me from a societal and business leadership standpoint, that becomes the question. If you look at the workforce and you say, or if you are an employee, which one do am I betting my future on? Is it on institutional job security, which is a traditional model, right? Or is it on personal job security that if this place folds for whatever reason, or I suddenly get a manager I don't like, or I suddenly get a robot who gives me a bad eval, that I have the ability that if I had to move into the gig economy, that I could. Somebody once told me of a friend who was disabled, and he said, we call people who can walk tabs, temporarily able-bodied. Okay, and so we may think, or we may want to think that how far away are you from being a gig worker if you're not today, and if you were, how would you fare?
Mm.
Or you suddenly have to live in that world, which may seem abstract to someone who thinks they have a regular quote unquote job, and suddenly everything changes. Would you do well? Would you be one of the happy campers, a la Dan Goodstein, who thinks this is great, right? Or will you be some of the people that I think about sometimes that perhaps feel like this is a world that they can't control?
But that gets back to the one common thread I think between every conversation we have, which is the education system. And I think that at least in business and technology, my advice, the advice I give to people when they say, "What should I tell my kids to do?" or whatever, is to be have a portfolio, be entrepreneurial, be versatile. If you look at how many jobs our generation has in a lifetime versus our parents and our grandparents generation, right? That's evolved. And I'm sure I'll get some pushback for saying this, but I think that for the same reasons why I think you were critical of the gig thing, I think the gig thing is better because I think the trust in large corporations as employers has changed. I mean, we had a member a few years ago. I won't mention who they are, but they had 35-year employees that they decided they were going to move their office from the East Coast to the West Coast to cut costs. And they told all their employees that they had 90 days to get their affairs in order, or they'd get either fired or demoted if they couldn't make the move. So are you better in the big company employee thing that you've vested in for 35 years, or are you better having the flexibility to work remotely as a consultant for that company versus be completely in bed with them?
Well, it looks like, again, for at least for large segments of the economy, the die is cast, right? And they've made the call to move to the gig model in steps, but it's a slow march, but it is a march, and it'll get there eventually. So I do believe that for a big segment of the economy, and it's much wider and in many different ways than people imagine. Healthcare, education, traditional high-end professional jobs are included, are headed in this direction. It just raises questions to the leaders of society and into business, to prepare people right for this world. Back to the original Outsourcing 1.0 question, I think one of the social failures in the US was that the political and business leaders didn't prepare people for what was going to happen. They didn't prepare Americans for the loss of jobs, for the wealth that was going to be created in places like China, India, and the wealth that was going to be lost in places like the Rust Belt, right,
Yep.
and other parts of America. And so we got a lot of social distress because no one told them this was a price of this phenomenon. Globalization will do many good things for many people around the world, but it'll do many bad things to people in the United States. And nobody wanted to say that.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
So if let's not repeat the same thing again. If we're headed to the brave new world where tons of people can be gig workers and have this wonderful flexibility, right? There'll be lots of winners, but there will be losers. And let's have that conversation at the business leadership and social leadership, political leadership level, so that everybody understands that this is where we're headed and what
Yep.
it's going to mean. Because I don't
Great
think
point.
that's quite happened yet. So hopefully it will then.
Great point. Great point. Well, I think that's our time for today, Carlos. Fun as always. It goes by. I thought we were 10 minutes in. We're like 45 minutes in, and fun conversation as always. Tell us what you think. These are intended to be discussions, debates. We don't have all the answers. We have the benefit of a large ecosystem, but we want to leverage it, right? So if you have thoughts watching this, please let us know. If you have suggestions for future topics on how we can help you become a better digital leader, please let us know. Again, you can check us out each week on Wednesdays at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, 6 Central European time, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, whatever you prefer. Also check us out on our new ERPA AI community platform. It's network.erpaai.com. And if you're interested in checking out our new research site, or you're looking for some custom insights, reach out to us at DEInetwork.com. Carlos, have a great week. Good seeing you again.
Sent to you, Dan. See you next week. Bye-bye.